And good afternoon. I'm here with Kate Gladstone. She is the author of a book called Read Cursive Fast, and we're going to find out all about ES. And there will be a link to the book and to buy the book in the writing part of the blog. So what I'm going to start with is asking Kate to tell us a little bit about your professional background and a bit about your overall teaching experience. So now it's all you. Go ahead.
Well, my professional background is probably unusual for someone who deals with handwriting in that it started out being a personal concern. My original career pathway was rather different. In college, I majored in linguistics. Subsequently, in graduate school, I wanted to go into library science and, in fact, was a school librarian actually for about a year until the handwriting concerns, as you'll see, crowded those out. But all along the way, it had been a really upward road for me because I happen to have several disabilities that affect handwriting performance. So when you talk to me as your handwriting coach, you are talking to someone who was not writing legibly until age 24 and in graduate school for library science. I would say right before I entered was when I started to conquer the legibility issues. And at that point, I was so proud that I actually wrote my application by hand and indeed got in. Very rare even back then, which was the 1990s. You're talking with someone who at that stage could not read cursive. And I acquired that skill as part of self-remediating on my own handwriting using methods which I later found out are not even supposed to work. And in fact, to most people's minds are not supposed to exist, which I did out of desperation because my life before then, you could say I started preparing for this career at perhaps age 5 because I was the kid who had the horrible printing, horrible handwriting, horribly clumsy, you name it, all because of reasons which were not going to be diagnosed until I was in adulthood. But when I was diagnosed, I was basically told, well, there's no help for it. You're going to type everything and you're going to take around a tape recorder and that's what it's going to be, which is useful, but is not always useful. Well, at one point, as I say, in my 24th year, heading into graduate school and facing the application process,
Oh
let
dear.
let that go. Don't worry. I don't want to take the phone off the hook because my husband listens. You will have to edit. Well, at one point, early in my 24th year, I had begun working on my handwriting. I was, in the middle of the acceptance process for graduate school. So I do like to say I was in graduate school at the time. As the process I will describe continued during my time in graduate school, I was working on my handwriting and I decided to do it on my own. And why I did was because I'd hit bottom. I was at home and I was doing some studying. I had various things in mind that I had to do. Let's just say, all the things you might have to do preparing for graduate school, shall we say. My parents said we're planning some kind of party or some kind of big event. I forget what. And normally, if I was at home, normally the answering machine, fire engine. Let's wait till it goes by. Amazon Prime trucks. Okay, normally I would have just let messages go on the answering machine if people called. Aunt Shirley called, she's coming. Uncle Abe called, he can't come. However, that day the answering machine was broken. I was alone in the house. My siblings were out doing whatever they were doing. I was basically plowing through some combo of trying to understand paperwork and cleaning my room, basically, and messages kept coming in. And I had to take down those messages. And I realized that to my shock, rather than my previous procedure of writing things out a zillion times, then saving the best one and copying that once more so it would be legible, I realized I was leaving on my electric typewriter, which is what we had back then instead of word processors. And I would type things instead of writing a rough draft and then write it out by hand. Well, I hit bottom. And as soon as I was actually within the hallowed halls of Long Island University, I took advantage of my access to terrific archival libraries all over New York City, where I then lived, and literally to look up the history of our past handwriting for as long as there have been published handwriting textbooks to see what went wrong, what went right, what parts of this could I do, use, and replicate, what parts of whatever handwriting system should I throw away. And at the time, it was nearly 500 years worth of handwriting books I went through. This year, it would be exactly 500 because the very first handwriting book in our alphabet in Western civilization was actually published in Rome, Italy in the year 1522. And believe it or not, there are reprints of it, including on the net, including with translations. It's something I have recommended I have recommended it to people. I'm not giving a link to it because a link to it actually exists in the bibliography of one of the articles that I did write and do link to, as you'll see in the blog. I don't
Okay.
want,
Well, I think that all this is now a perfect segue into the next question.
yeah,
And the next question is, tell us about what you actually do, your instructional model, what population are you serving, and just give us the how of how you spend your time.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then right after that, we'll talk about the why of how you spend your
yes,
time.
indeed. Well,
But,
I'll
but
start
let's first get
actually.
a picture of what your
Yeah.
teaching
Although
model
you're
looks like.
talking about the instructional model first, I think I'll address those out of order just to make this segue a little easier. The population I serve has shifted over the years. I like to say that my first student was myself, and my second student was my father, my late father, who had issues similar to mine, although a tad less severe. And after that, well, it was my father who encouraged me to take this public when he saw how his daughter had changed from basically unable to write legibly, at least when speed was of the essence, to actually being at the point where I was taking calligraphy commissions as well as writing very legibly. And he said, you should teach doctors. I took him seriously. And for about the first 10 years of my practice, the largest portion of my caseload was doctors, either individuals that I worked with, or in many cases, hospitals that hired me to deal with the ones who were facing malpractice suits. Now, that has all dried up over the past decade or two because we now have electronic prescribing and record keeping, which I think is a good thing. But I was at one point, it was anywhere from 50% doctors to 90% doctors and other healthcare practitioners, depending on, just what hospital was giving me calls that day. I literally was all over the country. At one point, I actually was in Florida in a place that had been zapped by Hurricane Katrina. That was actually my last job. 4 days after Hurricane Katrina, a hospital went, got its system back online after 4 days of the doctors operating by flashlight and taking notes by hand because medical records couldn't read a single one of those notes. They had
Wow.
to call me in to prevent it for the next time it happened. Well, over the years, I have increasingly heard from people with disabilities and from people without disabilities whose education has not, for whatever reason, seem to leave them either with adequate functional handwriting or with the ability to read others' handwriting. So I will say, however, that the disabilities part of the picture was very much a part of the picture, even in what I call the doctor days. A large number of the MDs either told me or appeared in my estimation to have many evident signs of the disorders we hear so much about now, the conditions, rather such as ADD, dyslexia, autism spectrum, all of this was just starting to be, we were just starting to think that, hey, grown-ups get this too. Anyway, I my instructional caseload, other than the doctors, has been from as young as a 5-year-old with Asperger's syndrome, with whom I worked long distance. He was in Canada, to high schoolers, college students, 20 and 30 something young adults. There's a sudden peak in people born since 1985, most of whom also ask for or are discovered by me to need the how to read cursive part of the picture. I want people to read cursive because it's out there. I want them to write more sensibly themselves. The instructional model I use is a revived 20th and 21st century version of the very first handwriting style that was ever documented in a published textbook in our alphabet in Western civilization, which is the italic style, which you may never have heard of. You may have seen it. It's the model for many forms of calligraphy, but in its essence, it's very simple. In fact, it is the great grandpappy, you might say, of all the instructional styles today. And it is the sort of greatest common factor of the things that work from all of them. So I found this in 500-year-old books. As I went through my reading, literally organizing it sequentially year by year, I found handwriting is like almost like the Grand Canyon, starts off at a fairly high level. Legibility may remain, but speed tended to have odd things happen to it as decoration took hold. Then, around the early 20th century, handwriting had been so complex that people said, let's all be geometrical and teach the little kids to write circles and verticals, and then we can totally change their handwriting later, with consequences we're still seeing, which have not, by and large, been good. But now we actually do have some people who began in the latter half of the 20th century, some of them in the early half of the 20th century, but who have proliferated to the point that there are now curricula whose purveyors I know teaching modernized forms of the italic handwriting. Now, what's amazing about this, and I'm going to actually write my name at the top of this so that I can hold it up and you can see what italic looks like. And again, this is not going to be a perfect version because this is going to be my signature. And I want to show you it doesn't have to be perfect to be read. A lot of the conventional cursive has to be perfect to be read. A lot of the conventional printing can be read no matter what you do with it, but if you don't do it perfectly, it looks horrendous. Whereas if you look at this writing, you see very print-like shapes. You see some joined and some not joined. You see that the letters, which would be harder to join, simply don't get joined. And in italic, you have a lot of wiggle room for this. I join some letters other people might not. I don't join some letters that other people do. Now, what's amazing is that, as in one of the research items, which I quote in one of the articles you will link to, there has actually been research done on handwriting speed and efficiency by people who really were not thinking about 500-year-old handwriting systems at all. They just wanted to see what happens if we look at everyday writers, adults, preteens, teens, kids, and see how do the fastest and most legible handwriters actually write. And amazingly enough, in this research, at the end of the previous century and throughout the beginnings, what have been the beginnings of this century, they found consistently the highest speed, highest legibility handwriters tend to have very print-like letter forms. In the situations where there's a disagreement, so to speak, between a printed and cursive letter, let's say such as the capital G, let's say, they will have something that looks like the printed one. They will not be totally joined or totally unjoined. They will tend to have joins where the joins can actually happen out of print-like letters, but not otherwise. In other words, something like AP is likely to be joined. Something like PA is much less likely to be joined, simply because the join out of a P into an A is motorically and visually much more complex, to the point that doing it literally takes more time than just letting your pen get off the paper. In other words, the world is full of people who rediscover the wheel and who are told that they are wrong. So my notion is teach people to write more sensibly themselves. Teach people
Okay.
to write, yeah,
Well, that's kind of the perfect segue
teach
into the
people
next
to write
question.
cursive because it's still out there. If you
Okay.
want, yeah,
So,
to read cursive rather. You have to say not to write, but to read conventional cursive. So that segues into my book.
right, it certainly does. And so, let's talk both about, I want you to talk about your book at two levels. What you as a writer, because you're looking at maybe a future author of a book who's kind of interested in how writers get started. And a lot of my audience are in that situation where they want to write a book or an article. So a little bit about you as just a tad of you as a writer. And then the rest is the nuts and bolts of what you're talking about. And I think you've kind of given us a pretty good overview. And by the way, I'll point out to my readers, that the best way to find out the details of this is to actually get your book and read it. But
That
yeah, but let's talk about you as a writer first, and then the nuts and bolts of what you teach your students.
myself as a writer, of course, I had thought for years, ever since, my 24th year, maybe I can do something with this other than help myself. But I was teaching people to write clearly and rapidly for years before I thought that others besides myself might have an issue with cursive. The earliest roots of that book began when a former colleague, now retired, told me he had an employee who was in his mid 20s. This was actually about 2003, and the employee could not read cursive. And could I do anything to help? Handwriting wasn't an issue for this person's career, but reading his boss's handwriting was. I ended up doing little cards illustrating literally how our alphabet letters had changed over the 500 years between an originally simple published italic style and what we now know as, I like to say cursive as we know it, conventional cursive. And I'm actually drawing a little sketch, which is similar to one in my book and similar to one that I have on this card. And I'm doing G because that's in my name and that was my particular, nightmare producer. And it was for this employee also, as I think it was in his name. But you can see that we have a sequence. If you see how our letter G happened, you will not be confused when you get to the most elaborate ones that we see today. And you won't be confused knowing which one is the G and which one is the S. In other words, if I were to ask you, a lot of people wouldn't know that which one was the G, but if you look, which one has a G hidden in it? The answer is very plainly that the one on the left has the G hidden in it, and the one on the right has an S hidden in it. So everything in that deck of cards, which eventually became my book many years later, is there in order to help people find commonalities between the forms they know and the forms that perplex them. But I didn't actually get started writing my book until a few years ago when I was speaking on handwriting and the issues of output and input. In other words, how we write and how we read handwriting, using my own life story as a source of information as well as research. And after the presentation, a woman came up and asked with a very pleading tone if I could please write a book on how to read cursive. And I was overjoyed because I thought, will anyone want this other than me and a few random people who've asked? And of course, my students, whom I've always checked out if they could read cursive, a lot of them couldn't. Well, she did. We began to work together on what became Read Cursive Fast. And by work together, I say I would write things, I would submit them. At one point, I was sitting down with this lovely woman, and she was going over my whole rough draft with me in a hotel room. And her name, by the way, is Bonnie Arnwine. She is the owner of National Autism Resources. You may want to put in their link. Actually, I will probably send it to you.
Oh, absolutely. And as
You
I'll do
don't need
something
to
like as indicated in the blog and
first
put that link in.
detail link so you can put it in. And I learned as I worked with her, like me, she is dyslexic. Unlike me, she was diagnosed early. However, like me, she'd had cursive interventions, so it was coming out her nose. And at the time we met, she couldn't read cursive. She was 51, and she had the same experience I had had till age 24 when learning the history of handwriting had made cursive click for me. She was still at the stage where she looked at cursive and literally only saw it as scribbles. And so, of course, she was fascinated with what I was doing, that she begged me to do. Well, she went through the rough draft as I wrote it, and believe it or not, by the end of that, she read the rough draft and she could read cursive. Boom.
Wow.
And so I took off
That's
3 years
powerful.
to have what I call the cursive reading binge, where she went around and literally read everything she couldn't read before that wasn't cursive. Shop signs, logos, greeting cards, letters from family, notes from coworkers, up to and including the Declaration of Independence, which she'd always wanted to read. Does it really say what the textbooks and the encyclopedia says it says? Well, fortunately, yes, but she'd never been able to read that. And here she was reading it. There are people who think you have to write cursive to read it, and they think that writing cursive is the only way to read it, but that's not so. I have taught kids who could read print but could not read cursive to read cursive and to surprise everyone. And when I say kids, remember one of them was as young as 5. But I will definitely and do definitely work with everyone. My caseload has included ESL, disabilities, multiple disabilities. In one case, someone whose disabilities seemed to be because her parents had been against her being left-handed. Unless you think she was really old, she was in her 20s, by the way. And that was 10 years ago. She would now be in her 30s. And in one case, I had to work by TV, and this was before Zoom was cool. I was one of the first people to tutor handwriting remotely, and I was working with a young man in Egypt whose parents were American diplomats. They had gotten their son accepted to a very prestigious prep school in the USA, but the prep school had one condition: they wouldn't accept him unless his handwriting was legible. Could it be made legible in the 6 weeks between then and the date school would start? And could I make sure he could read cursive? Yes. But the parents were very on the ball to ask me to check about cursive. A lot of the parents don't say, oh, come on, my kid's in high school, my kid's in junior high, my kid's in middle school, my kid is in the gifted and talented program. Of course he or she can read cursive. Well, I check them out, and of course they can't. And yes, I don't write cursive except to demonstrate or to check if someone can read it, but I can write cursive now because I see how it happened. Many of my students, in fact, picked up the ability to write cursive from seeing how it happened because they could then read it.
Okay, so, I think that is absolutely the perfect segue into saying, hey, folks, if you want to find out the real details about all this, get the book. And I know if there are parents out there or individuals out there who have this particular problem, I'm certain you're going to get some visitors. So thank you so much for all this terrific information. And just can't wait I'm hoping that you certainly do get a lot of hits on people interested in that. And are you currently taking on clients, by the way? If I
certainly am. Although at the moment, of course, my time is divided among clients and further writing because I've been asked to do a lot of articles. You've seen some of them.
Right.
Of course, I am planning to do a series of handwriting instruction textbooks. I have not, I have written some drafts of this. I have a lot of notes. Whether I do it or not will probably depend on how well Read Cursive Fast continues to sell, because if it doesn't reach a certain point, my publisher probably won't want me to do another book. I don't really want to go the self-publishing route because my publisher, Bonnie Arnwine, believes in this book. After all, it helped her. It helped a lot of people in our focus groups, and we would hate for it not to have the impact it has. I want her in a position where this book can be out there. Now, good news is I have actually heard from someone in a European country, which happens to be one where the language does use our alphabet and where a lot of people do study English. Handwriting there, although they have a lot of cursive handwriting, some of the letter details are different, but they want me to write in this book. They want me to do an Italian edition of the book. The country is, in fact, Italy, and there are a lot of people there who have the same concerns about the handwriting situation that we do. And apparently this has been even less recognized by the educational establishment. I'm fortunate that one of my languages is Italian, because I'll have to work on the translation. It can't be a straight translation because word lists have to be rewritten. If I need words that have to use certain letters in certain chapters, obviously have to rewrite them. There's a section on reading historical documents, which I have to rewrite so that we're looking at key Italian historical documents. For instance, I have to make sure that letter models, which are illustrated, in sections where I say these are the different ways a letter G can look, I have to include the ones that come from Italian language copybooks, for instance. This is going to be a hard row to hoe, but it's exactly the row I want to hoe, given that the first ever textbook on handwriting, the one that got me started, or I must say restarted as an adult, came from Italy exactly 500 years ago. In a way, this is how I get to pay them back. If you've ever seen Italian cursive models, let's just say that they're having even more difficulties than we are, and for some of the same reasons.
Well, with my last name being Bomarito, I was listening attentively. Okay, well, I think we've reached that point where there's that final tradition on a Bomarito interview that we do the Zoom wave goodbye. So thank you so much and goodbye. And
Thank
folks,
you.
all the links that we talked about will be in the blog itself. And good luck with all
Thank you.
your future
Remember
endeavors.
always, handwriting can make sense.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.